My name is Patrick Marks, and I run the Green Arcade Bookstore across the street. Thank you. I also want to please save it for the end. I wanted to first say that we are taking place in the unceded lands. Are you okay? The Ramatush Ohlone. And we will set up our microphones. I want to thank Robin Azevedo, whose grandfather built this building in 1925. Where's Robin? Thank you, Robin, for the McRoskey Mattress Company. I also want to thank the Guyana Wright Lecture Series, who helped put this series on, and also the San Francisco Poetry Center. And just a couple things. There are a couple restrooms over here behind you. We do have some non-sustainable water over there on the table if you are feeling that it is a bit warm tonight. And your Jesus is our director of communications. And if the fan in the back gets to be a bit too much, let me know and I can turn it off. And of course, we want to mostly thank Stefano, Harney, and Fred Moten. And it's great to have Fred back in the Bay Area. And actually, you are an original Bay Area man. So, anyway, without further ado, Mr. Steve Dickerson from the Poetry Center.
I'm going to be brief. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and just a delight to have Fred and Stefano here in town for a week. This is like when, the art ensemble and Cecil Taylor and all those guys used to come to town and be in residency at, Concepts Cultural Gallery for a week, which was just a fantastic world at that time. And but tomorrow night, Fred and Stefano will be, what's the name of the place? It's a coffee house, right?
Red Bay.
Red Bay Coffee. Okay, and you're supposed to RSVP to a place called Matatu, which I did and they never let me know, but you can try that. And on Friday night, they will be at the Lab, which is Cap Street and 16th, so just near the 16th Street Bar. You all may know that venue. And, when I want to thank Ellen with the Bagley Wright Lecture Series, Ellen Wilker, who got in touch some time ago and asked us and asked others. These guys were at Berkeley, UC Berkeley last night, and the lecture was shared with the Scalapino Hygenian lecture, and so some of us were there last night. And but Ellen has organized this whole tour for the Bagley Wright Lecture Series on poetry, so let's thank Ellen Wilker. And yeah, some of the Bagley Wright Lecture Series books you'll see over there are on sale, as well as books like Stefano. And when this started happening, it occurred to me, I've been carrying around All Incomplete for about a year now in my bag, and it's almost as dog-eared and riddled as the undercommon, my copy. But the opening of this book, you will know if you've opened it, is for Manolo Callahan, to renew our habits of assembly. And the last time that some of us saw Fred was, not counting last night, was 2 years ago in March 2020 at the Lab with Manolo in conversation. And I think that's the very last thing I did before the lockdown. And then I think it was like Monday, you didn't go to work. And so I've invited Manolo Callahan to introduce Fred and Stefano. So please welcome Manolo.
It's certainly an honor to be back again with dear friends and the community slowly becoming a part of. And we were all together, and when everything broke apart, I guess, for a while. Just down. I should say first, just by way of an advisory, if anybody wants to interrupt or commandeer this process, by all means, go ahead. Something we learned last night that it's absolutely necessary to deconstruct these spaces, the academy, the lecture, etc. And of course, last night's quote-unquote lecture was brilliant, right? And I should also say that I'm a little nervous because it's been 2.5 years. I feel like I should be on a Zoom screen, and it'd be a lot easier. But of course, I don't have to do 4 lectures, four nights in a row. So why am I nervous? But I should also just kind of say it is a tremendous honor. It really is, and this is such a brilliant space. But let me just continue and just start out with a couple of confessions. One confession really is I feel a little redundant, right? Patrick from the Green Arcade and Steve from Poetry Center have already done all the necessary kind of work, acknowledging folks from last night out of Berkeley and what's coming up at the Red Bay. Is it Red Bay? Yeah. And then at the lab on Friday. So that's pretty much all we need to know so that this process can continue. But I should also confess that, and this is why I explain why it seems like I'm kind of rambling. I had all this brilliant shit I wanted to write down last night. And, you know, because I got home late, because I was, you know, in all these conversations, I said to myself, I'm going to write it down. I'm going to get up and jot it down. And of course I didn't. So I don't have anything really brilliant to say at all. Right? So here I am. But, and of course, the redundancy, you know, in the confessions are really just kind of also a segue into some protocols that maybe are still necessary. Much of the protocols have already been taken care of in acknowledging all the people who made this space possible and all the hard work that made it possible and made it possible for our friends to join us again, for us to convene again. And really, and this is, I think, why our 2 friends here are really the poets of our conjuncture, in that they're helping and very consciously and creatively helping us weave together and maintain the social fabric of our community here in the Bay. And they've been going back and forth, you know, Berkeley, tonight in San Francisco, back to Oakland, and then back to San Francisco. And really kind of bringing together the social infrastructure of community that we are trying to kind of work and build together as a part of a autonomy that we're trying to reclaim and rediscover. And these are the poets that help us speak that autonomy. Help us see that autonomy, even though it's pretty much obvious shit, right? It's still pretty obvious. But we need somebody to articulate it for us. We need somebody to herald what it is that we see when we kind of claim that autonomy. So that's certainly a protocol that we want to take seriously. The infrastructure that's being built around here, and you know, families making open spaces like this available for us to be community. So. Another protocol, because this is a political space, of course, is to acknowledge who's in the room and to start talking about the kind of political work that's underway. I'm not going to really do that other than to announce myself as a member of the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy and Acción Zapatista. They're also members of the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy, as is Harney, Paradise over there. And just to say, again, who's in the room, so, you know, as people speak later on tonight, they can identify themselves, and we know what worlds they bring forth as they share their word with us tonight. So I wanted to kind of pick up that. And then also use that as a segue. In CCRA, we often try to mark the conjuncture, which is to say that we're trying to understand what we're up against, and really the Fourth World War, the everyday violence that's especially impacting folks of color and women, right? And the war against subsistence, and really a war against oblivion. That's what the Zapatistas kind of in a kind of neat phrase called the Fourth World War. So we want to acknowledge that in the sense that we also want to acknowledge what we're up against and how we're resisting that war. And it's in that conjuncture, in that war that's becoming more visible, right, that's becoming more observable, that we need our poets. And arguably, based on what we heard last night and what we're going to hear tonight and the next 2 nights, these two are the poets of our conjuncture, most definitely, right? I think the other point that we often want to make as CCRA is we try to claim and discover what we call convivial tools in struggle. And one convivial tool that we've been all participating in, there's other folks here, Gina, Leslie, some other folks here that are part of what we call Sikpa. And Sikpa is a Mayan term that literally means to shred the word. And the idea of Sikpa as a convivial tool is it's a tool that allows us to gather in smaller groups to shred it up, to tear it up, because the word is too harsh, and we have to maybe shred it up a little bit to understand more fully what we're trying to convey to each other, so that we have fewer quarrels in the larger assembly when we actually finally do gather, and where that gathering hopefully isn't lonely, right? If that gathering is entangled, right? And so in Sikbal, we had a little Sikbal, as there were probably many Sikbals after last night, no doubt. Small groups of folks kind of parsing and kind of critically reflecting on the brilliance that was shared with us. And in one Sikbal, we were thinking, well, the sermon, the elected, right, the elected, what they shared with us in the sermon, really called for subjects. It called for certain subjects. And for example, in one case, the student. So the student subject wants, of course, to rehearse and summarize the brilliance of last night, right? The brilliance of, now I'm going to look it up. I have to look it up, the paradox of the self-important intellectual work. And to think of that paradox in the context of the decaying university, the privatized, commodified university, commodified everyday life, commodification of everyday life, and so on. The militant, I'm also an adjunct, so I also occupy the subject of precarious worker. I'm an adjunct and desperately looking for a job. In fact, I have a job interview tomorrow. And in that job interview tomorrow, I'm going to try to convince the committee that we don't need to lecture, we don't need to job talk. Let's just get together and make shit happen and make shit work, right? And see if that works tomorrow. Wish me luck. Right? The third subject that comes forward is the militant cultural worker, right? And I think everybody agrees that what we need to do is transcribe these 4 sessions and make a pamphlet and circulate that pamphlet and circulate struggle, as these two have been doing in sharing their word and articulating and heralding for us what we're up against and how we might see what we already know that we're doing in terms of getting past this shit that we're struggling with. The last subject, of course, is friends, and we're just glad to be part of this fellowship and welcome our friends into the Green Arcade, Poetry Center, folks at Berkeley, folks over in Oakland in the lab. We just want to welcome again our friends to share their work.
Thank you. Yeah, you want to start?
Sure.
We should start with our dedication, probably.
Yeah. So, first of all, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. It's a pleasure to see everybody, and we're really glad to be here with you. We began last night by saying that, you know, we've got a kind of general title for these lectures, and it's Felicity Street. And we're slowly working our way to the point where we can explain what that is. I don't know if it's tonight, but I guess maybe towards the end we'll try to say a little something about that title. But we began last night by saying that we're dedicating these lectures. And the over sort of arching structure of them to our friend and colleague and mentor and sister, Fumi Okiji, who teaches at UC Berkeley. And so we feel like we're here, you know, under her protection, and we just want to make sure to mention her name again. Last night we tried to do a kind of complicated thing, or it felt complicated at the time, which was we wanted to attend very much to the specificity of the Scalapino Hegelian lecture on innovative poetics. And we wanted to acknowledge both Lynn and Leslie Scalapino as again, our sort of guiding presences for us in the thinking and the work that we've been trying to do. And at the same time, we wanted to begin or to kick off, you know, this series of lectures, which does connect us up with some, you know, which we want to try to connect together in a loose way through some certain themes and certain questions. So, so I hope it's not horrible if I kind of take a chance to summarize just for a minute some of the things that we tried to talk about last night, in the hope that they'll carry over somewhat to
Maybe
today.
just before you do that, Fred, we should give a little update on our saga, which will explain why you're reading from your phone.
Yeah.
When we arrived in the Bay Area, first of all, thank you all for coming here tonight, and again, special thanks to Patrick, Steve, to Ellen, and to everyone for being here. We were so happy when we got here. We both have these kind of roots and attachments and mythological entanglements with the Bay Area. And it was sunny, and we were in Oakland, and we got out of the car, and we were so happy to go see Fumi, and we spent the whole afternoon with Fumi, and it was really glorious. And then we came back to our cars, and then we remembered suddenly that we're idiots. And you know, we left all our bags in there, and someone had come in and taken them. And so we were without our laptops because of that. And they took everything. So they also took like my passports, his car keys, all that stuff, right? So, and I have to, after these lectures, one reason they're a little bit squeezed is I have to go back to work in Germany on Monday. But last night we came back to the hotel, and there was a message that somebody had found the bags, and indeed there was this Good Samaritan who lives next to a vacant lot where they get dumped, and so he'd collected it up, and the laptops were still gone, of course, but I got my passports back. Fred got his keys and his glasses and things like that, and that's why we're reading from the phone. But also inside our bag were passports of two Venezuelan guys from Florida who'd also had their stuff stolen, and it had been wrapped up with us. So we spent a lot of the day sleuthing to try to track these guys down to give them their passports back, because obviously they have no consular services in this fucking country, right? So they're not going to get their passports back unless they get them from us, right? Finally, by the end of the day, thanks to Fred's thorough research methods on Google, we discovered that they're in a band, and that they had been out here on tour in a van, which had been broken into. And we discovered it because there was a GoFundMe about this van that had been broken into, and the equipment and the passports had been stolen. So we've now got in touch through GoFundMe to try to tell them that we have their passports and to try to get them back here. So sorry, that's a long digression, but it explains why we're going to be looking into our phones like we're on social media. So
it's this left punk band from Venezuela who moved to Miami a few years ago called Zeta. I don't know if y'all know the word. And so we'll find them.
We'll find them.
Where are they playing?
Where are they playing? It's a good question. We should try to find out.
Try to find out. But anyway, yeah. So
yeah, sorry. So that's why we're on our phones.
yeah. So, and part of it also is strictly a function of just kind of disorganized bad memory. And so what we were we were at this we were at this place yesterday called what was it called? Honors Cafe or Honor Kitchen? No, it was Honor. Just regular old that word Honor. It's in Emeryville. It's right there on Powell in Emory, and it looks like a place that predates, you know, the sort of mallification of Emeryville, and of course, so we were sitting there and we didn't even have pens or paper, so the guy gave us like a little he you know the tape that you make a receipt on. He pulled some out of it, and so we wrote some notes on the tape.
Yeah, that was our first lecture.
That was our first lecture.
This runs on the back of a passport application.
Yeah. And it's so this morning I knew I would lose that piece of paper, and I didn't want to. So I typed in to my phone. We communicate through WhatsApp. So I just typed the notes in and sent it to him on WhatsApp. So this is the summary of the lecture, of those notes or something. And of course, you'll note that even reading this is already to go against the grain of what it is that we were trying to talk about, but just so you know. So we began, you know, with a couple of etymologies. The etymology of lecture, which goes back to the Latin term lectare, to read, a reading, but lectare is also the root of the word elect, as in the elect, the chosen. And so we were concerned with what it means to give, what does it mean for the chosen to give a reading? There's another use of the word lecture that's always in the back of my mind. And our dear friend David Kazanjian is here, who's a great scholar and literary critic and historian. So I'm about to say something that I'm almost sure is wrong, so please correct me. I believe it's from the second version of Frederick Douglass's autobiography, which is My Bondage and My Freedom. There's a moment where, you know, he continually, in those 3 volumes, sort of elaborates further on these basic, fundamental, you know, essentially sort of primal scenes of his knowledge of his own enslavement. But there's a sort of pre-knowledge moment of his childhood that he latches onto, especially in the second volume. And he's talking about one of the other enslaved women was sort of in charge of the children and had been particularly harsh to him in a moment when he was very small. And his mother came in and he said, and she read that woman a lecture that she could not, you know. So we could also talk about the reading of the lecture as a kind of protection, as an expression of care. That's why we don't want to, we're not trying to denigrate or disavow the lecturer, precisely insofar as that impulse to speak, to say, just like what Manolo was just saying, it emerges not just out of love, but out of a very specific kind of protective love, given the ubiquity and the intensity of the war against subsistence. Somebody has to say something, you know. Anyway, okay. But there's this problem once the one who feels called to say something starts to feel maybe sometimes that they have been, as it were, elected to say something. That's part of what we want to talk about tonight under the rubric of betrayal. And we'll have much more to say about that. The reading of the protector, the one to whom is given the gift of spirit, supposedly to redistribute it. Can we speak of a distinction between the called and the chosen, which corresponds not so much to the distinction between the many and the few, as in many are called but few are chosen, but maybe between all and one, that all are called on, and individuation is the sort of the mindset of literally of the one who feels that they have been elected to speak, as if in some kind of substitutive relation to all. Okay, I just accidentally called him. I'm sorry. Okay. There's this fallenness of the all which seems to militate against the lecture, or at least to set it within the general frame of an open field or a hard row. An open field theory, an open field poetics of the lecture, then. A poetics of continuous structure, where Scalapino's continual conceptual rebellion turns towards continuous rebellion against the concept. And one time Steve will talk more about that. Is there a relationship between concept and equilibrium? Robert Duncan quotes Ernst Schrodinger's book, What is Life?, where Schrodinger defines life as the refusal or the resistance to falling into equilibrium. Okay. And we're interested in whether or not there's a relation between the concept and equilibrium. Is the refusal of the very idea of a conceptual scheme the refusal of imploded man? And we'll talk more about that tonight. The term imploded is one that we get from Sylvia Wynter, and we want to try to talk about and talk with her a little bit tonight. But what's the relationship between fallenness, equilibrium, and the occupation of a particular space, a particular point, to be relegated in a certain sense to a definable and locatable space and time. So last night we were trying to talk about the relation between two problems, the problem of seeing and naming, and today we want to talk about the problem of betrayal and involvement. And I think that's enough to get us started. So I'll shut up now.
We're shifting towards a group of thinkers, poets, and activists in Guyana tonight, and this has many roots and many sort of threshold guiders. One of which is Sylvia Wynter, a figure in the Bay Area, but a figure also of the Caribbean. Yes.
Thank you.
Is that better? Okay. And so as we shift to Guyana, we especially are going to focus on a couple of figures. One is the poet Martin Carter, whose phrase, "all are involved," keeps ringing in our ears when he's speaking about the 1953 rebellions in Guyana and the attempts to shake off colonial rule. We have also in mind the great Guyanese activist and intellectual Ndaya, whose work is now widely available to people outside of the Caribbean and outside of Guyana because of a next generation of amazing feminist activist scholars, most especially Alyssa Trotz at the University of Toronto, also Kamala Kempadu at York University in Toronto, and a number of others who've very carefully and lovingly brought her work forward for all of us. So we owe them a great debt when we think about Ndaya. And of course, in the back of our minds is someone who's been with us for a very long time, and that's Walter Rodney. And Ndaya and Walter Rodney were friends, and they worked together to set up the WPA in Guyana. Martin Carter was involved as well, Rupert Narayan, a number of figures that we hope to touch on, and at very least to signal the value of spending more time with them, if we can't do it all tonight. There are a couple of ways in which Ndaya's work in particular has struck us. One way has already been mentioned by Fred, and that is her willingness to speak about betrayal within movements, to speak about betrayal within the anti-colonial movement, within the post-colonial. And I want to read just a very short quotation from her that can help us sort of set the tone for what she's trying to say. This is from an essay called "The Historic Centrality of Mr. Slime," in which she's talking about a novel by George Lamming from Barbados called "The Castle in My Skin," and in which she's talking more generally about how George Lamming, who's a Bajan novelist, gradually over the period of his life turns from being a novelist to becoming an essayist. And she talks about why that happens, and she says it's a matter of the historical conjunctures of the time, right? But here she's identifying something that he first identifies in the novel, but then pursues throughout his life in the essays, including in essays like his eulogy for Walter Rodney and a number of others. This is from 2003, or at least it's collected in 2003. The Historic Centrality of Mr. Slime. Class betrayal is still the fundamental issue of our time. And part of the reason we do not know that it is pardon me. And part of the reason we do not know that is because we have not acknowledged who Mr. Slime is. We have not examined, with all of our learning and research, all the places he does his betraying. And therefore, we have not explored how the education most, if not all of us, here have received, has, in some measure, betrayed the movement we often claim to be part of and even speak for. That is what happens when novels are taken to be fiction and fictitious politics are taken to be reality. Mr. Slime lives, but so too does Brother Powell and his mother and his sister. And we know every day better that the many faces of the enemy. So in this, she's pointing again to a theme that's common in the post-colony, the betrayal of the class that takes power at the time of independence. It's something that C.L.R. James warned about repeatedly. One flag goes up and another goes down, but nothing really changes. And what we would like to do with that is not to feel any kind of way about it morally, but to think about what kind of structures are in that education that necessarily produce betrayal, which I think is what she's talking about in that quotation. That this is not a matter of a moral failing of an individual who decides to enjoy the trappings of power in the post-colony, but rather a structural condition of the way in which education operated during the colonial period and how it was extended in its same operations into the post-colonial period. So this is something we wanted to talk about because, although it's stark in the post-colony, I think it's a common condition. We think that we could talk about it, we could talk about ourselves in this regard. Me and Fred could talk about ourselves in this regard. Having been sent away to university, having been sacrificed into power, is it Ndaya that puts it that way? And the ways in which, all the ways in which you are sent, and the intentions of being sent, and the kind of separation that produces. We talked last night also about the loneliness that it produces, but certainly how it produces what Fred was referring to when he was talking about the problem of the elected, the problem of the chosen, which is a problem as much, if not more, for the left than it is for general bourgeois society. So these are some of the things that we hope to try to consider through these figures in Guyana and through Guyana's very particular, very intense history of colonialism, colonial revolt, and betrayed independence.
Who is the Mr. Slime?
So, Mr. Slime is a character in the novel, The Castle of My Skin. Well, you might want to say.
No, that's right. He's a character who comes out of the village, but eventually sells the village out from under the village. And Andaya says that she's very interested in this novel, in The Castle of My Skin. It's a bit of an aside here, but because she says, look, the novel's a bourgeois form. You know, Andaya doesn't play around. Right? The novel's a bourgeois form. But this is almost interesting because there's an attempt to have a collective narrator, to have a collective subject, the village, rather than the individual.
It's a really cool. I mean, again, connected to some of what we're trying to talk about last night. It's like, last night we were trying to think about, well, when I was in grad school, I guess, Charles Bernstein edited this pretty extraordinary book called The Politics of Poetic Form. And that's really some of what we're trying to talk about, If the novel is a bourgeois form, certainly the experimental poem is a bourgeois form too. Now, I am given to indulging in constant, play within that bourgeois form. So it's not like I'm speaking about it from some other position. Our friendship begins, in our sort of common infatuation with that form. And not just an infatuation at the level of, we loved the way language was used there, but the infatuation was totally bound up with the fact that we sensed that there was something in that form that was absolutely necessary to insurgency. Okay. Given that, that's why we can't take a position against Mr. Slime as if he were not us, right? But just pause for a second. That was a wonderful question. Thank you so much. And you've established a fundamental protocol for the evening and for tomorrow and the next day too. Imagine that the imperative is not to wait until the Q&A, but to ask the Q when it comes up in your head, right? And we'll get so much further than we might ever have gotten before. And it could be, who is that? Who are you talking about? What book was that from? And maybe we'll know the answer, and maybe somebody else will, but we'll figure it out together. And it'll make everything, I know that it will make everything work a little bit better. Okay. So just to kind of really repeat, Manolo mentioned the term redundancy. We want redundancies here. There are licks and phrases that should and need to be repeated. They need to be said again, and this analytic of betrayal that Lamming and Andaya in a way sort of work that role in common together, as friends, as former lovers, as part of a general pan-Caribbean insurgency that was almost from the moment of independence beginning to mourn its lost promise, right? When I say mourn, I mean to say it in a way that doesn't indicate some possible turn toward melancholia. The mourning was a critical mourning. It was an attempt to begin to reestablish the grounds for an insurgency almost in the morning after independence, right? It was as if the assumption for the necessity of a new insurgency was already given. Right? But so Andaya says, to just repeat the phrase that Stefano mentioned before, what's at stake is to understand betrayal as a condition that seems to have befallen those who are, and this is, so she puts it so beautifully, nurtured and sacrificed into power. And it is this problematic interplay of nurture and sacrifice that maybe constitutes this sense of what it is to have been chosen, what it is to have been elected, and at the same time, it is that which becomes the object of our critical, gaze, because there's a sense in which what one has to do is to imagine some way of opposing the condition of having been chosen with something like the condition of having been called, which again becomes not this opposition between the few who are chosen and the many who are called, but the one who is chosen and all who are called. And this distinction is especially operative in the work of Martin Carter, and it's operative at the very moment of Guyanese insurrection in 1953, really which kind of kicks off a new moment in the history of Caribbean insurgency, and an emphatic moment. And so I'll just stop this little section by reading this poem called "You Are Involved" by Martin Carter, which was in his first book of poems, and which responds directly to the conjuncture of 1953. I'm sorry, I got it online. This is a little bit. There's still, but it'd be cool to just let people see what there's. And it's again, it's just funny how things work. I met Alyssa Trotz at a talk that I was involved in at the University of Toronto, and she gave me that book. And then something else happened. You know how you are introduced to something, and then you get introduced to it again as if it was the first time, and then it only allows you to remember how much more to remember the real first time more richly. So the second time was, I don't even know. Again, through Stefano, oh man, I'm sorry, I'm about to digress in 5 different directions. So we got books over there, to sell, but there's 2 books by Stefano which are crucial, which we don't have because they're a little older and harder to get. His first book, Nationalism and Culture, right? Not Nationalism and Culture, that's Rudolph Rocker. It's
called Nationalism and Identity in a Caribbean Diaspora.
Yeah, and coming from research he did in Trinidad in the 80s, late 80s, and then a book called State Work, which is in a lot of ways, do you think of it? I think of it as an extension of the first book in many ways, if only because it's dealing with the way in which working in the state operates for many people in that same diaspora at a different one in Toronto. But anyway, so that's part of the ground of this discussion. It goes way, way, way back for us. But we had, talking with some other friends of ours who are interested in Caribbean music and just trying to understand the historical grounds of that music, with some of our friends, including Fumi from this group we have called the Mardi Gras Listening Collective. And we were passing around articles by these, great intellectuals, especially Norman Gervin at that moment. And I happened upon this amazing film about the 1953 Guyana insurrection called The Terror and the Time, written by one of Martin Carter's sort of students and proteges, or made by something called the Victor Hara Collective, which was led by one of Carter's students and proteges, a man named Rupert Roopnarine. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff to be said about the complexities and richness and problematics of the sort of Afro-Indian split in Guyanese politics that is already given in this interplay between these figures. there's a beautiful interview in Film Comment that Andaya conducted with Roop Narain when the film first came out. But the key sort of voice, so to speak, of the film is Martin Carter, his poetry, which is being read by another great Guyanese poet and scholar and political activist, Yusi Quayana, right? So there, anyway, there's all these names, and I'm mentioning these names, and so you'll follow them, you know what I mean? So, and I'm, well, anyway, okay. This poem isn't actually read in the film, but it's in many ways a fundamentally important poem for the very idea of Caribbean insurgency and independence over the last 70 years. It's called You Are Involved. This I have learnt. Today a speck, tomorrow a hero. Hero or monster, you are consumed. Like a jig shakes the loom, like a web is spun, the pattern, all are involved, all are consumed. So that's another point from which we want to begin to think through this question of the relation between betrayal and involvement.
One of the things about the richness of Ndaya's work is that she doesn't just make an accusation of betrayal. First, she's also talking about herself. Even in that passage I read, it's clear that she's talking about our education, what our education does to us, including herself. But also because Ndaya has a lifelong practice that spans from her early, what she would call her traditional left activism, into a very specific feminist activism, and then you could say even into this later period in which I don't even know how to name it, but I will try to describe it a little bit. So she works with Rodney, and then at a certain point, she starts to understand that a kind of autonomy has to exist for any kind of feminist initiatives to develop. She's centrally concerned throughout her life, but especially in this period, with what Fred's described as the colonial inheritance of division between descendants of Africans and descendants of people from South Asia. For those of you who know the Caribbean, after emancipation, the plantation owners in the States looked to various sources to replace the labor. And most prominently in the Caribbean, this was people from India. But Guyana is also very interesting within the Caribbean configuration. It thinks of itself very much as part of that configuration, but it is on the mainland of Latin America, as you know, of South America, and it has a significant indigenous population. So Ndaya is actually always involved in a kind of three-way articulation about women's issues and women's struggles in Guyana. A couple of interesting things about her thought. At a certain point after she doesn't leave the WPA, she doesn't leave Walter Rodney's group, but she starts working much more heavily with a group called Red Thread, which is a grassroots women's organization. The grassroots women's organization is composed of people like Ndaya, who had a chance to go away to university, and working class women and rural women who did not. So, and she's very aware of this difference inside. And she starts to talk about the impossibility of what she calls non-hierarchical organizing. The impossibility of non-hierarchical organizing, right? When I first read that phrase, I was like, did I read that phrase backwards? Did she say the possibility of non-hierarchical? But no. She began to speak about the necessity for people to organize according to their level of power. And this meant that you couldn't organize across levels of power. You had to organize first. And so the groups itself and the work they did began to consist of a whole bunch of different groups doing autonomous organizing according to who they were. So the sex workers no longer just came to the regular meetings, they had their own organizations, et cetera, et cetera.
Can I ask a question though, of like, in this betrayal involvement, how that rubs up with the notion of sovereignty in your studies?
Yeah, thank you. It's very direct, because the way that betrayal really shows itself in the anti-colonial struggle is through the idea that sovereignty becomes the goal of the struggle. But when sovereignty arrives, it arrives with that betrayal of the local middle classes taking power from the colonial masters, and then beginning to work hand in glove with international capital and imperialism to perpetuate the same systems of division, exploitation, extraction, etc. And of course, the way that they do that is not just by declaring national sovereignty, but personal sovereignty. They become figures who claim that they have the self-generating, self-determined, self-possessing ability to make decisions for others, to be elected, to be chosen, and to stand apart in those moments. So sovereignty is a central, let's say, trap or weapon in all of that betrayal. So yeah, I think it's quite important, and I think that Ndaya is working at this in her practices, and she starts to work. Red Thread starts to do all these time use studies with working class and rural women, where they document how they spend their time in order to show that they are doing this incredible amount of labor, far more than the men who have traditionally organized by the left because they labor. In the course of this kind of work, she also constantly has to question, who knows what they're doing, who's best at doing it, etc. And gradually, what emerges, and this happens, for instance, in some of the interviews and some of the great work again that people like Kamala Kempadu and Alyssa Trotz are doing. And Ndaya starts to say, look, at a certain moment, I realized that that I couldn't do the kind of research that these working class women were doing. They were better at it than I am. But then, there's another moment where she says, and then came the moment where I realized that they were actually the experts in this research. So it's no longer a question that they gather raw material and I'm the expert. It's now a situation in which actually, she says, the people who are doing this work are the best at doing this work, right? So she's trying to work out a way, amongst other things, a way not to betray, but also a different way to think about, her position as a kind of lecturer, and that the documentation of that work of Red Thread, which is still going on and is now in another generation, is a documentation about the struggle against betrayal. And that's why it's so extraordinarily rich. But it's also, and I'll stop here, it's if you work in a university, it's worth thinking about someone who's saying, when it comes to research, you're not the best. And when it comes to theorizing that research, you're also not the best, And maybe thinking about that not in terms of panic about your expertise, but about what opportunity that might mean for you, for us, for me, to get away from being chosen, and and to find some other way to work with people.
I didn't want you to stop. You got to start right back up again. I just wanted to quote the Alyssa Trott's essay called Red Thread, The Politics of Hope in Guyana, just to amplify or whatever what Steve was just saying. Trotz writes, Red Thread crystallized this point with a time use survey it conducted in 2001 and 2002, in which 102 women from 11 communities on the coast of Guyana and in the interior completed their own diaries detailing their daily workloads. The project was significant on a number of levels. It was Red Thread's first large-scale effort led by and involving grassroots women working with each other, in which they were their own experts and subjects of their survey. It enabled women to define work and make it visible to themselves and each other. And let's say, well, what one way to think about it is, what does it mean to be, how might that be conceived of as a challenge to sovereignty and to the desire for it? Because what's at stake here is something other than a self-knowing, self-determining political subject of history. That's not what is being cultivated there. But rather a sort of ongoing practice of knowledge making, right? That isn't even predicated on the originary fiction of self-knowledge, right? And because it's an ongoing practice, it would never have arrived at that fantasy either, right? But what's necessary is this sort of an ongoing kind of research on what it is that we're doing. Right? Anyway.
Let me just add to that. Thank you for that. I've worked with an artist group called Post Commodity, a Native American group that's in the Southwest. And so we have conversations about this already of context. And so that's how we kind of locate it. And in the context of indigenous, kind of that the land has powerful juice, and that's a sovereignty. So I like what you just said about sort of understanding the agency that you have and as a form of sovereignty. Just thank you.
Well, but we're not really saying that. We're saying, it's funny. We're trying to say something, we're trying to say the same thing as you, but we're trying to say something different. If that makes any sense, right?
All ears, man.
But remember when we went to Hawaii?
Yeah.
Okay, so we got invited by an old dear friend of mine, classmate, Cynthia Franklin, to go give these, like a talk, at the University of Hawaii. We'd never been there. And I was totally freaked out. I was scared to go. And the reason, I shouldn't even be saying this. I gotta fucking say it now, but the reason is because I'm freaked out by the land acknowledgement. I totally agree with the land acknowledgement. I believe in the spirit of the land acknowledgement. But I find it hard to acknowledge prior ownership of land because I don't believe in ownership that way. And yet, I know that the acknowledgement is meant to indicate two things, not just theft, right? But also the fact that there was a kind of thriving here that was a better way to live. That there's this other way of living that we want to acknowledge. But I just felt like it takes too long to say some shit like that. And I don't want to disrespect indigenous people's claims for sovereignty. But I don't believe in sovereignty. right? Like that. And it feels to me like the history of a certain kind of post-colonial insurgency that we're trying to talk about is the history of the necessary failure of sovereignty and the necessary opposition of sovereignty to what it is for all to be involved, right? So this was the dilemma that I felt. I didn't want to disrespect, and then I met this Native Hawaiian woman, and she came up after the talk, and and she just hugged me, you know. And I said, you know, I gave this critique of sovereignty in my paper, and and you know what she said? She said, we know what we mean when we say sovereignty, you know. And I was like, okay, and that was all. You know, I was like, okay, you know. So I feel like I know what you mean when you say it, and then there's what, yeah, and then there's what, you know. And then there's what, you know. So there's a problem that we're trying to understand. And the problem is what happens, how do we understand the transition from anti-colonial practice, okay? What happens when anti-colonial practice turns into neo-colonial policy, okay, within the framework of a post-colonial situation. That's the dilemma that Andaya is trying to understand, but also live through. And the other name for that dilemma, and we've been studying this and learning this from Manolo, one way we could talk about it as the history, you know, of the war of conquest in this hemisphere. We could talk about it as the history of the war against subsistence. Manolo's been studying Du Bois, and Du Bois gives us another language to talk about it that Manolo's working through, namely, and Ani, the history of democratic despotism, right, to use Du Bois's term. This is, what we're trying to understand is what does it mean to live in this moment, in this history, in this conjunction, and also, you know, how to resist it, how to fight against it, recognizing that the specific dilemma is, what does it mean that we are constrained and conscripted to use bourgeois tools in order to enact the practice of liberation? And what's our responsibility when, and some of those bourgeois tools are conceptual tools, right? And this is why, you know, the idea is to imagine some other kinds of tools. Manolo, by way of Illich, calls them convivial tools. And one of the questions that we're raising and that we've been thinking about is, what if the concept itself, okay, is a tool of democratic despotism, right? What's the relationship between sovereignty and the concept as such, right? These are some of the questions that we've been thinking about, and what's at stake now for us today is the recognition that it wasn't just Andaya who was thinking about it, but she was thinking about it in conjunction with the women with whom she was working, right? And it gets us, again, in other words, what's the intellectual work? What's the revolutionary intellectual work that's being done, you know, in the space where Red Thread operates? The question that we're asking ourselves also to get to the title of our talks is, what's the social and intellectual work that's being done on Felicity Street? And again, that's another tease, but maybe towards the end I'll say, one of us will say something about Felicity Street.
Thank you.
Okay. So.
I'm not sure how long we've been going now, or should we be thinking about, it's 8:15. Would you like to maybe move into some questions and answers, or just hear more for us, or?
Anyone can grab the mic if they wish.
Did we say anything?
Do we ever?
I'm not Jewish, but we're approaching Passover, and I celebrate Seder because of the liberation story that tells. The Exodus, going to the Promised Land. And part of that gestalt for the Jewish people is wrapped up in the Jubilee, the 50-year restoration to the land of everyone. And because, according to the storyline, God made the world, there is no landlord. And so there was no debt associated with occupation of the ancient land of Israel, at least this is the storyline, because of the partition of the land such that every family had enough calories, productive land, to be able to be independent. You could say sovereign in that sense, but as a nation sovereign. And the extension of that is what captures my imagination, that is from using the elected, the chosen people, to who, if everyone's the chosen people, how do we extend that relationship to land such that there is no, as I think of it, and I think this is probably a bourgeois tool, but how do we rid ourselves of the privatization of rent, the rent of land? And that's what, again, occupies my imagination, is how to achieve that, and we've opened up that thought for as part of it. I think part of your query, in fact, is inside of that. I want to throw that as a question there.
That's all right. We're going to be talking about New Orleans in one of the coming nights, and there's a great young poet working in New Orleans called Fahima Ife, and she's got a phrase. She says, "No way where we were was there." So I think the place, no way where we were was there.
And it's her phrase?
It's her phrase, yeah.
And but it's also Nate Mackey's phrase?
Yeah,
They share it.
yeah, yeah. It's the title of her, like a project that she's doing. You know, that's sort of where we're starting, is from the idea that you can't go back to parceled, available land. You know, we're not in I wouldn't say, I hate people who say, I'm not interested in this. We don't think it's possible to practice a politics of redistribution.
May I clarify? So partition of the economic value of land, not partitioning of land is how I think of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Not literal.
No, I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying, because we're starting from this other place, inspired by people like Nate Mackey and Fahima Ife and indeed the entire Black radical tradition and Black radical aesthetic, there's no going back to a sense that of there's enough land or there's the right land for the right person or anything like that. We're trying to imagine an involvement in living that's not based on shares, but on being shared. And so that just leads us to different questions and to read and be interested in different parts of the people that, of the work of people that we're trying to present.
There's this philosopher, was a great philosopher at Berkeley when I was going to school there, named Donald Davidson. He's one of the key figures in sort of the Anglo-American philosophical project, you know, in the late 20th century. And he, there's an essay he wrote that I think is sort of key here. It's called "On the Very Idea of a Conceptual Scheme." Right. The idea would be that, you know, the problem would be, how do you formulate a conceptual scheme? How do you distance yourself sufficiently from that which you would conceptualize in order to in order to actually, you know, in order for the concept to, as it were, you know, sort of materialize. Is that distancing possible? Is that level of detachment possible? Right? Can we separate ourselves from that which we are trying to think? And the answer for us, you know, it appears to be no. Now, what's the answer? What's the difference? What's the relation between occupying a conceptual scheme and having a plot of land? And on another level, standing your ground. Where what it means to have a plot of land, to occupy a plot of land, is to, in that moment, one's identity is absolutely entangled with that land, right? Now, you know, this is why we talk about what it means for somebody to be the king of their castle, to stand their ground, to make that kind of claim. That's at the essence of sovereignty. And it's probably, you know, again, according to Sylvia Wynter, it's at the essence of a certain understanding of what it is to be human. So much of the insurgency against slavery, against genocide, has been about what it would mean to reclaim the status of the human. How do you reclaim the status of the human when that notion of the human has been predicated on the ownership of land, the standing of one's ground, the ownership of things? How do we develop an insurgent notion of liberation, right, that isn't itself grounded in that retrograde set of assumptions that we tend to talk about under the rubric of liberalism, right? These are the questions. So if Orlando Patterson says that the most extraordinary figure in recent human history is the Creole slave, what it appears to be the case is that Wynter is saying, if that is the case, if that's true, what's extraordinary about the figure of the Creole slave is that is given to that figure by way of the notion of the plot that produces a certain set of possibilities for independence, a certain set of possibilities for self-sufficiency, and even for subsistence in the general, within this framework of the general war against subsistence. But how do we, but we all know, how is it that, does it make sense that our ongoing fight, that the ongoing persecution of the war of subsistence, which is given by way of the notion of the ownership of a plot of land, by the planting of a flag, right? What does it mean that we are constrained to take up those same conceptual tools? So you know, that's why the notion of what it is, of what it means to be involved, you know, the etymology of involve is rich too. What it is to roll, what it is to be rolled up in, you know, to be folded into something. These are, you know, and what's it mean that she could, that Andaya could, with her friends, with the people who were her friends, that they could develop this new way of thinking their own sociality, right? And is that, you know, what we're trying to begin to think about is maybe that practice of thinking, maybe those convivial tools that they had developed were outside the framework of this sort of brutal conceptuality that we seem to be, that sometimes it feels like we're trapped in. It's as if they were operating independently of the very idea of a conceptual scheme. So, and what would a poetry be that operates similarly, you see? I mean, this is something else that was part of the undertow of last night. where, you know, the reason that the great Berkeley Poetry Conference of 2015 didn't happen was because people didn't want to be in the same room with a bunch of so-called conceptual poets, you know, namely, you know, Vanessa Place and Goldsmith, in the wake of, you know, his thing with his shit on, you know, Michael Brown, and in the wake of her ongoing reconstruction of, you know, which is a pun, you know, her ongoing reconstruction of Gone with the Wind. So, you know, how do we, what's the relationship between the figure of the elect, the figure of the electable, and conceptuality? These are the questions.
I wonder, could I ask you about,
Could you?
oh yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Again, when you're talking about involvement and betrayal, I'm hearing these sort of echoes of these ideas that I think are increasingly prevalent of complicity and guilt. And I think those are different than how you're thinking of involvement and betrayal. And one of the ways I'm seeing the difference is that with involvement and betrayal, there's a sense that something really was supposed to happen and that everyone was involved in it and then it was betrayed. And with complicity and guilt, there's a sort of distance and really an expectation that nothing was going to happen, but there's sort of a generalized condition of being stuck or continually tied to something bad, exploitation, etc. And I think, you know, the university in particular is arriving at an extremely advanced state of taking up complicity and guilt as sort of things that it can teach us how to conquer in order to reassess the continuing relevance of ourselves or our concepts with sort of the performative value of the land acknowledgement as doing something like that, perhaps. But I guess I was just wondering if you could think with me a little bit about that. Is there some line between involvement and betrayal and complicity and guilt, and is there a difference? And just to briefly add one thing, just strikes me that that is such a dominant trend in contemporary poetics, this constant question of is the poet complicit with something bad, and how does the lyric speaker either purge themselves of the bad thing, acknowledge the bad thing, this sort of individualization of conditions that I think you are wanting to describe as general. What would it mean to, how could we, as individual intellectual workers with our concepts, sort of regeneralize these feelings? What would it, and I guess I'm interested also in what you're saying about the impossibility of non-hierarchical organizing. And so what does that sort of generalization or allness look like in these sorts of rooms? Bit of a hodgepodge. Thank you.
I don't know, what do you think? Well, there's a lot there in your question. I think there's a lot that's just true, and I agree with you. Just coming back to the Caribbean for a minute, and then maybe I'll shift back to the university. It's worth stressing the continuous revolutionary activity of the Caribbean from, from its beginning, but also in the period that we've been focused on. It's not just 1953. Eventually, in the 60s, Guyana does gain its independence under a socialist government. Then gradually the country devolves into dictatorship, Forbes Burnham's dictatorship, against which Andaya and Walter Rodney and others are organizing. And during this period, they're also inspired by the Grenadian Revolution, which becomes this really crucial region-wide revolution, which destroys itself in acts of betrayal. So it is true that when Andaya is talking about betrayal, she's speaking in epical historical terms. There's a lot going on, and of huge consequences. A betrayal has huge consequences. I mean, after the Grenadian Revolution implodes, the Caribbean goes into a very long period in which struggles in the Caribbean remain at the grassroots level and don't rise to the level of challenging any of the states or challenging capital or anything else. Almost only now are we starting to see, a reemergence at the state level. In fact, in Barbados itself, with the leadership of Mia Mottley, we're seeing finally a challenge again to what she's calling the new international order. So yes, Andaya is speaking in these big terms about these large struggles. She is, as we've been saying, also working at this very level of daily practice. But I think there's a link, because complicity in the way that you're talking about it is the festering wound that's going to lead to betrayal in each case. So maybe it looks like an either or from the outside, but I think it's all going on here, which means in turn that I think that's true in the other case, that when we are thinking that we're just seeing complicity and guilt, that doesn't mean that there are not also more bigger struggles at stake. And when I mean bigger, I especially want to be sure to say I don't mean bigger in scale. I mean deeper in consequences and possibilities. The other thing is that, complicity itself can be thought in different ways. It does tend to be thought for us through our vulnerability to sovereignty. So we do tend to think, I'm complicit in a university that's charging high fees, or I'm complicit in an art museum that's, exploiting black artists, or, for its own gain, or whatever the case may be. But there are other ways to think about complicity, or to flip it, in which the complicity starts to attach to you in a different way. Because if you leave it at that level, then the next step is always strategy. I'm complicit, so I'll have a strategy, and my strategy will be, I'll put up with I'll do all the things the university wants me to do, but in my classroom it'll all be different. That's a strategy, right? And of course, strategy just further individuates you and further pulls you into this sense of complicity. But we could also think of complicity differently, and the way to do that would be to think about how they are thinking about complicity, because they are thinking that you are complicit. And when they say that, they don't mean you're doing what you're supposed to do in my institution. What they mean when you're complicit is, when I see you, I think to myself, this person's not here by herself or their self. There's someone else there. There's an accomplice. This person is complicit. Something's going on here that's not supposed to be going on in this institution. And every time I see you, I see it. I see this conspiracy. I see this complicity. I see unseen accomplices, right? And this is our advantage because it's true, right? It's true that we are in a conspiracy against them. It's true that we're complicit with each other. It's true that we have accomplices who are unseen, you know. And it's true that someone else is pulling my strings, you know. And you know, so, but then I think that's the moment where we realize, this is connected to struggle too. Depending, you know, complicity and guilt can also get articulated with struggle when we start to flip it. I don't know, it's a great question. And, you know, we're all in the middle of it. All are involved.
Thank you. I love
Yeah.
that.
Anybody else?
Well, yeah, I was kind of thinking along similar lines when Fred was talking about the problem of the plot. And I don't know whether you were doing the kind of cool dissonance of like multiphonics, but the plot as a kind of like, you know, planning to that, like fugitive planning on the Creole.
Well, I mean, again, this is, I think what you're, so on the one hand, there's the plot at the level of a kind of, you know, notion of novelistic structure, right? A story. What it is to, you know, remember, Hannah Arendt says, in order to be a person, you have to have a story, right? So some of the implotment that Sylvia Wynter is talking about is what it means to enter into the condition in which it is possible to have an individual story, right? And she talks about it specifically, I think, as a modality of humanization or of rehumanization. That when you have a plot, when you have a story, okay, you are no longer a crop, right? You are no longer that which was planted and grown in this new land, but you become, you know, capable of a certain kind of agricultural, you know, activity and insurgency. Okay? That folds into what it means to be functioning within the general framework of a certain notion of economic man. And it seems to me that Wynter understands the intensity of the double edge of this, right? That to be folded into, to have a story, you're folded into the old story. You're folded into the old story of what makes one a historical being, and you know, and it wasn't just you know that the you know what it means for the Creole slave to claim a plot is all bound up with what it means for the pilgrim or the planter to have moved on these shores in order to claim a plot. Those stories are entangled. They are complicit. They are folded into one another. But I also think that what Wynter is saying is that there is no space of purity from which to imagine an operation that would be wholly separate from that historical condition. What this requires then is the necessity of something like what one might call a plan, and then that's where plot comes in. That this is, that all of this, that this implotment is happening within the general framework of an insurgency against the normative story, right? And you know, how do you, it's an ongoing problematic. It's the plot of the people who have no plot,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
It's a conspiracy without a plot.
The conspiracy without a plot,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the you know, what it means to hold and share land outside the framework of a certain sort of normative ownership of it, right? It's the you know, the sort of, you know, the groundedness, so to speak, of the displaced, right? Spelled D-I-S space P-L-A-C-E, the way Nobessi Phillips spells it. You know, so what's at stake is the politics, or sort of non-politics, a radical sociality of displacement. You know, placement spelled P-L-A-C-E/M-E-A-N-T, the way Baraka spells it. Right? And you know, the ones whose statement concerning their spatio-temporal constituency is, there's no way that we are here. Okay. There's no way that this is now. Because they are accompanied, you see, right? They got people who are with them, right? The conspiracy includes, you know, the co-presence of the ones who are not present, who aren't here anymore. We're trailed and accompanied, you know, by the lost, you know, by the ones who never, you know, arrived. So this is a conspiracy without a plot, and at the same time, it's a plot of the ones who in a certain sense disavow the plot, who cultivate the plot without owning it, right? It's the plot of the ones who are not operating within normative, you know, Kantian, Newtonian space-time, right? It's the quantum plot, you know, like Moore Mother would say, you know, or something, right? And this is the you know, this is the plot. It's a, again, it's a, it's kind of like the same thing with the word sovereignty. Even this word plot, it's like, you want to say, well, no, that's not the word. This is the word. Okay? He's like, no, we can't counter that word with another word. Okay? We can't counter the falsity of that name with another name, because the falsity is given in the very idea of the name itself. But at the same time, what we can do is counter the falsity of the name with an absolute proliferation, right, of the practice of naming. And which is a poetic practice, which is an insurgent poetic practice. It's like naming without the name. I mean, I think this is what we're going to talk about tomorrow. But, you know, or it's like Cortázar, I played that tomorrow. You know, but this is the again, you know, this is what we pursue, you know. This is the pursuit of the pursuit. This is the, you know, the plot of the ones who resist the plot, who are against the plot. And I think what we were trying to say is that it is, you know, what, like you said, Michelle Cliff calls it the edgeless, centerless Caribbean, right? You know, the repeating island, you know, the unlocatable place of what Julia Scott calls the common wind. It is not just one place among others in the ongoing notion of the history of that, you know. So we invoke winter, you know, as a way of bridging a certain relation between the Bay Area and the Caribbean. She spent years at Stanford, you know, and still here now. And then at the same time, we want to then think about, you know, New Orleans as a northern Caribbean city, and Newark as a similar place, you know, because what's at stake is what it is to be involved, you know, in this plotless plot, in this displaced non-local insurgency against a war of against the prosecutors of the war of subsistence who who always want to keep everybody in their fucking place. So.
See you tomorrow.